And now I am very happy to present to you all our speaker, Monique Tu Nguyen, who is the Executive Director of Matahari Women Worker Center. Welcome, Monique, and you can start sharing your slides now.
Oops. Hi, people. Is it everything look good?
Yes.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session. The title of the session is around disrupting the culture of exploitation, how low-wage workers are fighting gender violence through building power. I also want to name something around the semantics and languages around how we define low-wage workers, even though it says in the title, because titles can only have so much size. Low wage workers implies as if the workers are deserving of the low wage, but it's actually the industries themselves are low wage and workers are in that context. So I just want to rephrase that. Um, and let's actually start with my story and then we can get into your story too. Because a lot of building power inside this movement is around storytelling. That is the most powerful tool that we use in the movement because we believe the people who are directly impacted are the ones who are experts, not the researchers, not the people who study or who are public speakers around the content around the gender violence, but we really believe that survivors are the ones who are the true experts, but haven't gotten the chance to develop that narrative and that story and given that platform to be honored around their expertise. And my story starts off over 10 years ago. I was a formerly undocumented student in Houston, Texas, and I was working many jobs just so I can pay tuition in Texas or college. And I was undocumented, so that meant that I didn't have access. What I thought I didn't have access to in-state tuition. So I paid 3 times as much in tuition compared to my other classmates. And I worked in restaurants, I worked in domestic work. And it wasn't unfamiliar to me as I grew up in a family that was immigrant family that survived on low wages and worked tooth and nail every day to put food on the table for us. And whenever I graduated, I just didn't feel right about continue to work and not deal with the injustice that's still plaguing my family. My family was still undocumented, and the deep fear of being deported or separated from my family was still a reality, despite me graduating college after many years. So I looked for the movement. I One day I did the most millennial thing I've ever done, and I popped out of bed having my own quarter life crisis, and I was like, oh, I typed into Google search immigrant rights movement. I didn't know what immigrant rights was. I didn't know what movement was. But in that moment, something came to me and I typed that in. And on 3 pages of Google search results, on the first page was a bunch of California campaigns and coalitions. And New York was on the second page. And I was like, California is too expensive. New York's too scary. And then third page was Boston organizations and campaign. I'm like, I watched Legally Blonde. I watched Good Will Hunting. Maybe I can handle Boston and seem just right. So I saved up 6 months worth of money working at the restaurant and working as a nanny during that time, and I saved 6 months worth of rent just so I can move up to Boston to find my political home. Where would I contribute my energy and my dreams and desires for justice? And I stumbled upon Matahari. I was ready to leave and pack up my bags to move back to Houston, Texas. But here I was. I was smitten at a membership meeting inside a Winthrop little home with a bunch of women and differently gendered folks who were women of color, and just sharing our stories and just relating to each other in different ways I've never seen before. So I was smitten, and I just decided to put my roots here in Boston, and it was history after that. And before I continue about my story, our stories all intertwine because we're all collectively here in this present moment. So right now, I want to move you into your story. I'm going to do a grounding exercise. If folks are familiar with somatics practice at all, it's about, particularly this is really important for people who are doing work with in the movement because the work itself, we're seeing so much violence and experiencing so much vicarious trauma just by working with our people because they're surviving physical violence, economic violence, different forms of violence every day. And also ourselves, we are survivors of many forms of violence every day, and we don't honor that enough. So inside Matahari and also in my practice as a leader, embodiment practices is such a key thing to prevent a burnout of myself and also of my collective community. So I invite you all to join me in this somatics practice. And feel free to turn off your cameras are off. If you can close your eyes or look away, whatever feels comfortable. You can do this standing up or sitting in your chair. So find a comfortable position in wherever you decide to stand or sit. And place your feet on the ground, rooted flat as much as you can. Shoulder to shoulder width. Take a couple deep breaths for yourself. Your body might be resisting doing this because it's not very familiar that you do this for yourself. You might be used to maybe sighing or catching up with yourself, but this is deeply intentional breathing for you to ground yourself and be with yourself in this moment. So take a breath. Keep breathing and notice. Notice any sensations that you are feeling in your body. You notice a breeze on you. You notice a warmth that's grazing your skin. Do you notice some tightness, some tension somewhere? Notice that and send some energy there to release it. And just acknowledge it because that tension has been building and maybe it just needs for you to see it, to feel it. Because that is where a lot of our hopes and desires are bounded up because we are just so busy with the humdrum of working every single day. So spend a little time right now to breathe into that tightness in your body to release it. Keep breathing. Imagine shoulder to shoulder that this is your width. This is your width and your impact and your extension to the people who are around you, the people you care for, and the people who care for you. Imagine breathing into expanding the width and the extension of that into the wider community and yourself. Think about the height from your head to your tippy toes and your feet rooted into the ground. This is you being grounded and rooted in your purpose, in your everyday purpose and your essence of why you even exist in this world and how you move to action every single day. Your rootedness, imagine your feet and your toes as tree trunks and roots grasping to the ground and closer to the core of the earth. Because especially in this moment, and we're in a global pandemic still, we are flailing trying to survive and hold down ourselves and our people. So the more rooted we are, the more we're able to have anchoring to really survive all of this and move through intention of what we can do to get over this period, but also come from this period transformed and different, because this is what the moment calls for. So hold both at the same time and keep breathing your rootedness, your extension, and your width in this world. Keep breathing. And also take a moment to reflect on this really beautiful moment because we're breathing collectively in this moment. I'm hoping that a lot of y'all took the opportunity to disconnect from whatever's in your email, from your minds that's like haunting you, what you're going to do after this, to really give yourself this moment to also be in collectivity with other people. Because as we breathe together, the more hope that we can actually move together and transform the systems under which violence exists. So I'm going to count down from 3, 2, 1, and we're going to come back into place. Take your final breaths. 3, 2, 1. Welcome back. Hopefully that travel to inner space was nice, and know that that's always there for you, and that's your entitlement for yourself. I think a lot of times when we are with ourselves, we're actually in our minds. We're like in our heads because our heads do all that work for us to pay the bills, for us to function, for us to make decisions on our everyday lives. But we neglect how much our guts and our heart and our spirit is part of all of that. And they all work together. And you become more powerful when they're all in line and in sync. And let's move to another concentric circle of our story together, right? Um, and I want to learn more about our story as a collective. In the work that I do inside Matahari, we organize people, particularly women working in low wage industries. And a lot of times folks think that they are experiencing exploitation or shamed by themselves um, for what they're experiencing, whether it be low wages or not getting paid at all, being exploited for their services, being asked to stay longer without getting paid, being sexually harassed or even abused in work, but we're feeling like they have no choice to stay because of the paycheck that they need to put a head over their roof over their heads and food on the table. So I'm gonna ask for the administrator to put some polling just so I can see of the folks who are in here. Workers in all industries experience this. But we want to just get a litmus test of noticing, right? So here's some questions. Have you ever worked and was not paid for your labor? And this can go from your first job as a kid, as a teenager until now in present day. Like, have you ever worked and not paid for your labor? Have you just not experienced that? Um, and have you ever worked overtime and not paid overtime rate? And for folks who are unfamiliar with overtime, this particularly applies to hourly workers. So for salary workers, you work whatever hours and you get paid the same. But for hourly workers, when you work more than full time, usually 40 hours a week, you get paid a premium rate, which is a time and a half of your regular rate. Have you ever worked more and were not given that additional money that you were entitled to? And have you ever felt taken advantage of in the workplace? And this could be many things, being asked to do something that's not in your job description or just seem problematic or unsafe. So let's launch those polls just so I can get a little gauge. Is someone doing that? I'm sorry.
Yes, Monique.
Okay, I'm not sure if I see it. Thank you guys.
Yes, we see it.
Oh, okay, I don't see it at all. Thank you.
Okay.
Let's see. Okay, let's give it. Let's give it a couple minutes, just and then put in your responses.
Are you seeing the results now?
I don't see the results. If you guys can tell me the results, that's fine too.
Okay, so for poll 1, for the first question, we have 67 that have said yes. Have you ever worked and was not paid for your labor? 67, and 33 said no.
Okay. That's like a good like 1/3. Okay. How about the second one? Let's see. Oh, are they going at this? I don't know. I've never done this before. This is very advanced. um,
So poll number 2, it's have you ever worked overtime? And yes, 72%, and no, 28%.
okay. Wow, that's a lot.
And then for 3, taken advantage of, we have 95% of folks said yes, 5% said no.
Wow, that's like that's a yeah, that's surprising, but also not surprising. I mean, like we are mostly in a nonprofit context, and a lot of folks think that because we're in nonprofits, or in like movement work, that we aren't subjected to exploitation. But because we are under this certain economy and capitalist economy or exploitative economy, we learn that behavior. We don't know much else. I have a question here. The 30%. Hannah's curious about the 33% of unpaid labor. Oh yeah, totally. Because there's a culture of unpaid labor all the time. Even like women's work, right? Around like, or even people who are doing care in the household. Unpaid internships in the fields, different contexts, definitely. And I think there's a resistance of that over time as people are becoming more aware of like labor should be compensated, and there's like better labor protections for interns or people who are positioned to take jobs just for them to get ahead. Oh yeah, totally, internships for sure. There's a lot of more movements now around like laws around supported like protecting interns. Yep. Yeah, that's really helpful to notice. And imagine this is just in like professionalized fields, right? For what I'm suspecting a lot of our work. But it could be also our work whenever they were low-wage industries as well. Okay. And just I just want to name something. You might be noticing through my slides that I have a lot of historic imagery in the background. Something that Matahari has been stewarding the last couple of years in the movement is around movement history and how that is important to shifting culture, as we have to know our history is the movement of as for us to be more strategic as we move forward in our work, because I deeply believe a lot of our history is taken away from us, and because of that we don't have documentation and strategy to build upon. So something I always say is I really believe that in our history is a blueprint for our future. So we can iterate that and become more innovative. But because through the different forms of colonization and just historic erasure, that we don't get access to that. So this is a major project that recently launched called DW History's herstories.com. It's a domestic workers history, but a lot of you might be really surprised that a lot of domestic worker history is connected to a lot of other movement history, because we're intersectional. And you can, these images are pulled from that resource, and you can learn so much about racial justice, colonization, building power for workers on that website. Thank you. And in this image particularly, you'll see and on the right, I think Gone with the Wind. It's like a typical American old school movie that people talk about, but this imagery is the nanny, the domestic worker, just being the help in that context, and she's she is characterized a certain way. And you see that image here, and to the right are actually former slaves, so back in the day, and they were forced to do domestic work during slavery times. So actually, let's move to talk about Matahari, my favorite place in the world and my political home. And I just want to share, like, whenever I started, I joined Matahari. I was like 25. I didn't even know how to say my name without stuttering. I was so nervous, and for me to be able to present to you guys is a big growth in my leadership development. And in Matahari, we're a leadership development organization that develops the leadership of women working in low-wage industries to transform their working conditions. And originally, the founders in 2002, they were mostly focused on activism and also case management and dealing with a lot of um, cases related to gender violence in the Boston area. And because a lot of them were activists and social workers and attorneys, that was their expertise, and they were a volunteer group for about 6 years and solved almost like over 300 cases together around human trafficking, sexual assault, domestic violence. Um, yeah, and then Matahari used to also work with folks in the commercial sexual exploitation to like sex trafficking. And but the activists and organizers during that time, they noticed that, wow, after so many years of doing this, we are burned out, and we are noticing that we're actually not even like feeling that we're attacking at the root causes of why this is like happening, why women of color and differently gendered folks were experiencing violence and not being tended to and being discriminated against when they were seeking services. And so during that time, Matahari did a deep reflection, and they're like, we need a place, we need to transition and notice that there's a lot of survivors around inside Matahari now. We built a community around our activists, our advocates, but also survivors were sticking around and say, hey, what can we do? What can we do? And we're like, we're not social workers, we're not attorneys, so what can we contribute? And there was reflection and naming that survivors have stories that need to be used to transform power relations in the movement, and we need to figure out how to build power for survivors, for us to build a platform to speak out against violence in our lives. And during that time, Matahari was actually, as a name, we were burning out, so there were only a collective of a few of us, and folks were also surviving the domestic violence or sexual assault, and we didn't really want to talk about that direct violence. And people were proud of their work. People were experiencing work exploitation, but they were still every day getting out of bed and aiming to do work. And were like, maybe we can start where people feel powerful, where people feel part of their identity, where they feel powerful, so they can move from that, and hopefully along the way that they can heal the different forms of violence that they have experienced, because that's part of that, right? You start where you're powerful, and then it's like a holistic journey for you to heal and reclaim your power after experiencing violence. And I know so much is going on in the chat. I have such FOMO. I just want to like talk to everybody in the chat, but I have to. I'm hoping that y'all can lean on each other and talk to each other. And we're gonna have FAQs towards the end, so we can have a discussion towards the end if we have time for that. Let's see. So this is Matahari in 2019, before the pandemic. So Matahari went from a group of maybe 3 survivors and a couple organizers still hanging around with the charges, like, how do we build power inside Matahari? And during that time, I was charged with the big concept is like, how do we end gender violence and exploitation? I'm like, shoot, the only opportunity during that time and people were energized about was the domestic workers movement. And all of us survivors in the organization had experience in that work. So we're like, we can talk about that. We can share that story. And the domestic workers movement for folks who are unfamiliar who domestic workers are individuals who work inside households paid directly by families to do nanny work, to do childcare, for elderly care, for house cleaning, and that's the relation. And domestic work is one of the oldest industries ever, from the beginning of time, next to sex work. And during that time, the New York Domestic Workers Bill was in movement to pass, basically establishing labor protections for domestic workers for the first time since their exclusion in the 1930s. During the 1930s, after during a period when freed Black slaves were coming into the economy and working, there was what they call the New Deal, establishing labor protections for all workers except farm workers and domestic workers. And during that time, that was strategic for them to exclude those workforces because majority of people doing that work were freed Black slaves in the South, and legislators didn't want to give all those Black folks economic power. So till this day, the domestic workers movement, the farm workers movement, and even tip worker movement is undoing that policy violence against workers who work in that industry, no matter what race they are till this day. Even white workers are experiencing this harm to this day. And Mata Hari, this is a picture of our members assembly. And Mata Hari, we are a base building organization. So we believe that if there's more of us, there's more power, and the more we develop the leadership of every single person, our membership, to speak out and to organize our community, that we are able to shift labor conditions and transform our lives and protect one another against the harms of being ourselves as immigrants, as women of color, as Black people, as immigrants, as Asians, as differently people who don't speak English, and we do it multiracially as a base strategically, because we believe that no matter what, we know because of history, the industry, so it's like a churn and burn. Each industry, there is a cycle of different cultures and races or racial identities that are targeted for exploitation. So a lot of them will come in and out of the work because of that. Oh, we're done exploiting Black workers. We're going to exploit Asian workers now. We're going to exploit Latinos now. So we were like, we need to prevent all that from happening. Also noticing that all these workers, because they can't speak to one another, that they don't notice this collective harm across their communities. So we practice language justice in the organization. That means that we provide interpretation and translation for majority of our meetings, up to 6 languages at this point, and we will continue to do so as we build the organization. And yeah, our members assembly, this is like about 200 of us, and our membership is about 1,100. And we can our goal every year is to increase our membership and deepen the leadership of all of the people who are on our group. Let me move forward. Yeah, and I just want to share some pictures. Even though like we have political spaces, a lot of our work is actually in community space for us to be together. It's just simply being with ourselves and relating to one another. And this is one of my favorite things that we do every year, is that we do a retreat and we spend some time in a nice, beautiful place for us to align with ourselves and each other. I want to cycle back. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is connected to domestic workers and tip workers. Mata Hari, we've invested the last 10 years in organizing domestic workers because it was strategically the opportunity that presented itself, and that's where the energy was whenever we came into the organization. When I came to the organization, and you'll see pictures here on the right, is the founding of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, the organization that is the national voice for domestic workers, 2.5 million domestic workers in the country. And we've grown very fast and big because domestic workers is a workforce that has been silenced for so long, but they make all other work possible, because if domestic workers didn't go to work, a lot of people weren't able to go to work and function themselves. And tip workers is recently something Matahari took on in the recent years, because we also noticed that domestic workers and low wage workers, people, as the economy gets worse, low wage work just becomes this hodgepodge of all these jobs that workers just fall into, because of the opportunity that's presented with themselves, presented to themselves. It's the hardship of being immigrant or folks who are exploited, that is that you don't really get options to do work that you really want to do a lot of times. So we noticed that domestic workers were also interchangeably becoming tip workers too. That means tip workers are people, imagine all the people that who do tip work in your life. Restaurant workers, people who are waiters and waitresses, even back of the house workers who work in the back, they also get tips. They do something called tip share sometimes in restaurants. Nail salon workers, car wash workers. Um, so you can imagine anyone, and Uber and Lyft drivers, they're also tip workers themselves. And we noticed that these tip workers were also connected to a lot of their families as domestic workers. It can be their children, there can be their partners. And we decided that we had to be more expansive for us to really tackle the plight of exploitation in the country. And to the left here, you'll notice this picture. I don't. And there was this movie. I forgot the name of it, but it was based in Mexico. And this is the star here. That's dropping my. If anyone watched that movie on Netflix at all, it was about domestic worker in Mexico, and she came to our National Domestic Workers Assembly in 2019, right? I mean 2020, right before the pandemic hit. Yes, it was Roma. Yes, definitely Roma. It was like a key moment for the movement, because a representation means a lot too. You notice, like, even like having having the identities of workers reflective in culture, that's not really, it's more empowering and humanizing, is so key. That's part of a cultural organizing work that's critical for the movement too. Okay, let's move forward. Yeah, and I just want to share some pictures of then and now too, because to the right here is a picture of JFK with a group of domestic workers. Domestic workers, this is the part of the history stuff that I think that's so important, because the key thing that this was the aha moment for me in doing domestic worker organizing is that, shoot, there's so many laws that we don't know about that need to be implemented and are buried. You know, we can fight for laws to impact our lives, but if there's not enough people to implement them and not enough resources to implement them, they don't become real. And the reason why this actually became more emphasized for me is, like, during the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights movement in Massachusetts, we were doing research about what laws do domestic workers have in Massachusetts, and there was just an assumption we had the same rights, same lack of rights as the rest of domestic workers in the country. That meant, like, there's no labor protections for domestic workers because we were excluded. But little did we know, a couple like halfway through the campaign, a legal intern went to the JFK library in Boston, went into the archives and found this obscure letter from a woman named Melnia Cass that wrote on behalf of the Boston Women's Service Club in Boston, and she was imploring a legislator to sign the bill that they were working on. They're like, oh my gosh, there was a bill that they were working on before the bill that we're working on. And we actually learned that not only that they were working on a bill, but they passed a bill that established the right to unionize and the right to minimum wage and overtime, and in the 1970s. And this is me doing this work in 2019, learning this. And so workers this whole entire time did not know that they had these rights. Workers that I'm working with, we didn't know that they were entitled to minimum wage, overtime, and the right to form a union. And that was very distinct. And we only learned that because of history. And that little letter that led to this. And this is a picture of them being congratulated by JFK for their work in the White House. And to the left here, this is a picture of Olga as the present day leader inside Matahari, and also my boss because she's on the board of directors. And she is a perfect example of how domestic work and tip work just become part of your life as a person that's just trying to survive in this economy. And she is fighting 3 wage theft cases right now for herself. But she's been a leader with Matahari for 5 years, but finally she was ready and empowered, and she just came in hot, filing 3. Something came over her one day, and she's like, "I'm gonna file 3 wage theft bills, 3 wage theft claims," and she's fighting that. And we have campaigns for her right now under our wage theft campaign called Our Work Our Worth. And she is has 2 domestic work claims and a tip worker claim in a restaurant. And this is Olga, and she is also an inspiration of mine and my boss. I say that, but I also mean it. Okay, fast forward. Let's see. And just so they're on the same page here, just so I can name and like give location to how the economic, you might not hear it much because we're at a sexual assault conference, and I think, like a lot of times I've seen so much growth in the movement too, of seeing the intersectionality of different forms of violence. Gender-based violence is violence that is directed at an individual based on their biological sex or gender identity. It includes the physical, sexual, verbal, emotional, and psychological abuse, threats, coercion, and economic and educational deprivation, whether occurring in public or private life. And in our mission, we say gender-based violence because even though we hone in on the economic aspect of this, we recognize as individuals, as that we organize, they will experience these other forms of violence in their lifetime, and we honor that and try to create a healing space for them as they're on their journey to build economic power for themselves. And the definition of exploitation in our context is the act of using resources or the act of treating people unfairly in order to benefit from their labor or efforts. And it could look like excess working hours, hazarded work, low or no salary, no respect of labor laws or contracts, bad working conditions, and wage manipulation. And those are just some indicators that you may notice with the people that you work with. A lot of why we name that the root of exploitation and the economy that we're in is because of surviving policy violence that was inflicted on Black people during the times of after slavery. And till this day, a lot of the movement is learning so much about the intersection of all of that, right? And this is an image from a zine during the 60s, when trying to build multiracial power across groups, and they're very militant. But this is like the beginnings of the noticing of intersectionality, racism, imperialism, and sexism, and this is a very cool image. Okay, that was a lot. Let's take a little moment to breathe, y'all. I need a little breath. I'm gonna drink a little water. Y'all drink some water too. Great. So I want to talk about the just transition, because I'm really glad I'm hearing from Valor that there's other spaces that is uplifting climate change work. And you might be hearing this as the world becomes more intense around climate change and organizing around the just transition. And I did the poll earlier about how we are experiencing different forms of exploitation and being taken advantage of. And that is a commonality, because no matter who you are in this economy, you are on the left here, part of the extractive economy. So in essence, it's designed for us to be extracted from as people. So for us to position ourselves right here in the middle, all workers, we are in a cycle of exploitation. Even though there's a lot of resistance, even for me as a director of a nonprofit organization, I know there's a lot of conversations and problematic stuff that happens in nonprofit organizations too. But that is the cycle. That's the culture that we live in this world. So you have to do deep intentional work to resist that every day in your organization. And I'm also prone to that, but also have to do double time work to resist, to not exploit myself in the work, but also my team members, and feed into the hustle and bustle of nonprofit industrial complex, if people hear that a lot. But in this extractive economy here, I don't know, have folks ever heard about the just transition? I don't know if how much is this a thing in the essay world. The extractive economy is the one we're in right now. So the worldview is that it's set on, okay, this is helpful. So I can go a little deep. So just transition is our hope and desire that we are in this extractive economy right now, and we're trying to move towards the right is the regenerative economy. Right now, extractive economy is saying that we take more from people, we take more from the planet and not replenish it. And it's extractive and being very harmed. Yes, definitely. Climate change. The climate is it's big in climate justice, but it needs to catch up in other spaces for sure. And because we're all part of that. So we're trying to move towards the regenerative economy. And you might notice, it might feel very familiar to you right now, because the worldview is around consumerism and a colonial mindset about empire and developing countries just taking more from other countries, extracting resources from countries and our countries just so for us to have a comfort of life, and to extract as much labor as we can from people and pay them very little to feed wealth and power in this country. You might be hearing a lot because Amazon during this pandemic has made so much money, but it's off the back of workers and off the back of the earth, because all that production of material and also all the workers. And then how they're able to maintain and control all of the system is around militarism. And that is also connected to what we're learning around police in this country, because police is also connected to that. It's deeply, there's a lot of military in the police. It's one and the same to me in my set, but it's like military light, but it's interconnected. But we do the work in the middle to move towards the regenerative economy, where the worldview changes to caring and sacredness. Resources are when we take from it, we regenerate, so it balances out. And workers are not exploited, but they are also equal footing and respected with dignity and do cooperative work in their workplaces, where they have say, they have buy-in, they have ownership. And our purpose is ecological and social well-being for the earth and each other, for people, instead of wealth and power for institutions. And how we're able to hold and all of that instead of militarism. I can't say it so hard. And is deep democracy. I don't want to get too deep in this, but definitely there's great resources that people are putting in the chat. Thank you. And here's like a little simpler graphic here. And the way that Matahari, when we're working with people, we are focusing on the people aspect in the middle, but also keeping mindful of the larger movement we're in the context of. So here's some definitions. The extractive economy is based on the removal of wealth from communities through the depletion and degradation of natural resources, the exploitation of human labor, and the accumulation of wealth by interests outside of the community. And what we want through a just transition is a regenerative economy, an economy based on reflective, responsive, reciprocal relationships of interdependence between human communities and the living world upon which we depend. And here's just another slide of emphasizing what we're trying to move towards. Yeah, I love these pictures too, because these pictures are historic imagery of the women's movement, even though domestic worker history is deeply intertwined. So you'll notice like a lot of movement leaders in women's rights and civil rights have also fought for domestic workers, but the domestic workers' identity gets erased in all of that. Even Rosa Parks was a former domestic worker, but people don't really hear that ever. So here's some images here. And let's talk about power. So let me check how I am with time. Okay, pretty good. Power is what I'm obsessed with. But not in the power that like the crazy, like when you look at fairy tale, what's it called? The, Disney movies and the power of like, oh, Ursula in Little Mermaid or something like that, like evil power, but the power of people who are being harmed. And I that's my fixation all the time is how do we continue building power for our community, and how do we develop that? Just to name the definitions of power and the differences of the definitions. Um, Power is the ability to control or influence circumstances. A lot of times, whenever people come into the organization, they feel powerless. A lot of folks even in denial that they even want to be in community because they feel like there's no point. This system is so large. I can't do anything about it. So let me just be free and just like whatever the system gives me, I'll accept. And a lot of that's also connected to self-worth. Especially we have to notice as people who are experiencing different forms of violence, every time that you've experienced a form of violence, it takes away from your self-worth and your value as a human being. It could be around your lack of choice to move because of migration, your lack of choice to choose work, or even like choose housing because you couldn't afford to live anywhere else. Even be in circumstances or people taking away your power by like physically harming you in different ways. So power is something that we have to cultivate for each other and inside ourselves, just for us to be able to control and influence circumstances. But it's a lot. It's a lot, and it's hard work. Um, and then the difference between individual power and then power over, we hear it's connected to the militarization. Isn't I getting better saying that? But oppressive power is that, we notice that countries who are more authoritarian, they power over even bosses in exploitation, in exploitative contexts of companies, or even domestic worker employers or restaurant employers or Uber, Lyft. That's oppressive power because they kind of like force their hand to force you just to accept their conditions for them to make money and for them to take advantage of you. So oppressive power is when people and institutions use their power for their own gain and not for the benefit of everyone. Yeah, because it's centralized to benefit a few instead of the collective. And what we're aiming for is power with is that the balance between the institutions right now that hold the power and governance is that the workers, the people who are directly impacted by that power or laws, that they are in relationship and driving the resolutions of that power, so they can make decisions and change their conditions. And inside Matahari, we're actually this is the different forms of power that we have been aiming to build the last 10 years, and we're honestly in this mode inside Matahari where we're actually evaluating this. Should we add more forms of power? Because one thing we also have to notice, all of the extractive economy stuff and also all the possibilities of regenerative economy really surfaced during the pandemic. What was really amazing about the pandemic, even though we experienced deep violence of losing so many people because of COVID, that deep grief that we're experiencing, but we also seen like a lot of the things that the government or people just didn't believe could be possible became possible, like government resources for people, for housing, for food, um, for just like more like economic support for families that became more closer to reality. There was more cooperation, and people, and a lot of times people, because we get so burned from people just like trying to survive, that we don't really get to connect to so many people. We don't really trust people as much. And, you know, like, but during the pandemic, community really surfaced. So, like, people created mutual aid networks to get by, people delivering food for people who are immunocompromised or elderly. So people really like showed little glimpses of ways that we can actually move towards a regenerative economy where we are in cooperation with one another and supportive. Um, but yeah, so that because of the experience of the pandemic, we're evaluating this power building model. Are these the power building, these are the avenues that we focus on, but do we need more, or how do we become deeper in our analysis around that? And I'm going to cover the different forms of power that we work on through imagery, photography right now. So this is like I'm really sad that this picture is blurry, but but it was a very key moment inside Mata Hari's history, because after many years of I would say maybe 6 years of working on the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights campaign, where we established labor protections for domestic workers in Massachusetts. This is the day that the governor, Deval Patrick, signed the bill. And you'll see on the right with the woman wearing the turquoise shirt, and that is Angela Foster, one of our member leaders during that time. And the way that we build political power is our ability to influence laws, the way that they are applied, and who is in position to make them. So because of that value and the work that we were doing in the campaign, we weren't just a bunch of advocates, just, you know, willy-nilly going to the state house and speaking on behalf of domestic workers. We have a deep belief that nothing about us without us. And that's something that came from the disability rights movement and many other movements that use that same saying, that any decision-making table that impacts our lives, that we should be there. So we were really dog-headed about being in spaces and being in all this meeting, especially during negotiations of the domestic workers law, and even shaping it itself, the domestic workers law. Domestic workers put every provision and inspired every provision in there. And because of their deep intelligence and strategic mindset, we have the strongest Bill of Rights law in the country, that reiterated the law that passed in 1970s around minimum wage overtime and the right to form a union. But we also had provisions around trafficking and the right to notice if you get fired, so domestic workers um, don't don't lose housing because they get fired. And then we also had the right to written contracts. A lot of workers are scared to even ask for contracts. And because without a contract, you are able to be exploited or taken advantage of a lot of times, and many other provisions. And so Angela was a representative of our membership here, but she was actually part of the shaping of domestic workers law too. We had a forum where we organized over 100 domestic workers across the state, speaking over 5 languages, and we brainstormed all the things that we wanted to change the domestic workers law. And then you might, then there's some in the background, you'll notice we have like advocates and our attorneys that wrote the bill. They literally just took like flip charts that we made and like recordings and input from organizers, and they drafted the bill. And then that was what we stewarded for one legislative session, and we passed it. And it became a template for many other states afterwards to pass domestic workers law, and that's built upon. Can go to the next one. Okay. And here's another picture of political power, particularly with tip workers. Tip workers, especially during the pandemic, you know, people were naming like childcare workers and restaurant workers, like food service workers, as essential workers. A lot of times we were noticing that we were celebrating essential workers in healthcare, but we also didn't really like uplift the essential workers that were able to put food and care for children and elderly during that time. So here are restaurant workers in the height of the pandemic calling on Congress to pass one fair wage, basically eliminating some minimum wages for tip workers in the country. So um, during that time, whenever domestic workers and farm workers were excluded from labor protections, restaurant workers were also suppressed to not get minimum wage. So these tip wages haven't been, like, the tip wage in the country is I think $2.75 now on the federal level, and it hasn't been corrected ever since. And during the pandemic, wages with tips were down because people weren't eating inside restaurants, and if they did, they were very like cheap. They didn't want to tip people. So workers were leaving, a lot of times leaving work, having to pay the boss because they had to chip in for different things. So like tip workers not only didn't get tips, but they actually had to pay their boss. Then that was like a form of exploitation too, because there's some laws around that. But here they were at the height of the pandemic, leaving their houses, bravely putting their masks on, going all the way to DC, erecting this Elena the Essential is the imagery of the cultural organizing tool that we have on the left. It's like a 40-foot wooden structure, Elena, tip worker. And here workers are sharing their stories and how they are being impacted by the pandemic and calling on Congress to do something. They want a vaccine, like vaccine access for restaurant workers, because even despite being called to continue going to work, they weren't also getting prioritization for vaccines in that moment. So we had to call for vaccines and call for minimum wage just like everybody else. So this is them exercising that political power and trying to impact Congress. And then I want to move to narrative power. Narrative power is something that's one of my favorites because storytelling is something that's so much untapped potential in our movement and also in every single one of us in this room. Because we have so much life experience, so much to offer, and so much healing that we can do through our narrative. Narrative power is our ability to tell our own stories and make sure that other people understand our issues from our perspectives rather than from the perspective of people who would exploit us. And this is a picture of Lydia, as one of our leaders and also a board member of mine and my boss. She is a powerful woman. She is a direct care worker. She was scared to death going to work to care for her elderly patients. But she had to because her children needed to be fed. There wasn't a government response around the economic plight of people that couldn't go to work during that time, particularly for low-wage workers that didn't have savings because of the many years of exploitation. And she bravely did a profile with the Washington Post, and this is the picture that they took of her going to work. And she told her story as being also undocumented and being fearful that now that her family's home, are they going to be targeted for deportation? Because even though there was a pandemic, ICE was still a thing. Being targeted for detention and family separation was still a thing, and if anything, it became heightened during that time. And she was speaking out against that. And that's her story. And we were able to do some powerful work around that as well. And I want to move to disruptive power, our ability to use our bodies and voices to stop unjust systems from continuing to operate. And disruptive power, you know them: protests, actions, strike, like picket lines, right? Anytime that we notice that there is some form of this is terrible, we have to go to the streets and we have to stop the traffic, right? So this is also during the pandemic. Elena Essential being erected in the middle of Times Square whenever restaurant workers were called to continue work without any protections. There wasn't any provisions around protective equipment. The wages were still the same. There was no economic relief. The movement ourselves, we had to come up with cash assistance funds to provide support for workers because we knew our government's very slow. And we sprung into action and even created our own cash assistance funds But here, here they were stopping traffic in Times Square in New York during the pandemic, just raising the issue around what's happening to tip workers during this time and calling for the end of minimum wages and also for protection and vaccine access. I think there was, you won't be able to see it here, but there was about 100 people at this action. Just remembering how people were so fearful of of COVID during that time, but people really like, because they were so passionate and there was no other option, people left their houses to risk COVID to speak their voice. I'm gonna move to economic power. And this has a lot to do with um, institutions of our movement too, because we need to build economic power for us to sustain. In the reality of nonprofit context, like especially during the pandemic, a lot of people will invest in nonprofits during this time because we are getting the brunt. We're like the frontline workers for the frontline workers, frontline people that are experiencing the brunt of the extractive economy. So all the harms, all the isms were in steroids, on steroids. So you might have noticed a lot of our nonprofit organizations grew or had a hard time surviving. So economic power is our ability to make sure that money is spent on the things that we think are most important, our ability to influence markets and employment as organized workers or consumers, our ability to sustain our own institutions without dependence on philanthropy. We see economic power and political powers as directly linked. And this is also connected to workers having input on budget in Congress, at the state house, and the capitals, and also local economies, how local government, our tax money is being spent. So that means also developing the leadership of people to really feel like they can actually voice their opinion and participate in that level of democracy, and also build institutions for us to sustain the movement. This is a picture of some of the same action from earlier around calling on Congress to invest in protecting restaurant workers. Oops, we did this already. And one of my favorites that don't really get that much attention is transformative power. And it just kind of feels like, I don't know if this is like a not PC word, but crunchy, like people like the community aspect. Transformative power is our ability to show by example the kind of world we want to create, to transform ourselves and believe in our own value. And this is a transformative power that don't really make the headlines. You know, like a lot of the headlines really cover, hard hitting stories or disruptive actions or laws passing and whatnot. But the transformative power is the work that's like the spade work behind the scenes to build this community. I get really choked up that our community are full of perfect strangers. Like I didn't know these people even existed, and they're my political home and family, right? All these people, um, all these people, they are strangers that didn't know they even had a shared purpose until we gave them that opportunity to see that together, right? And now they work every day trying to come up with projects and campaigns and stewarding campaigns to undo historic policy violence and also support each other during difficult times. We even have like care committees for people who are going through violence or needing or facing houselessness. We have mutual aid groups coming up from our groups, and that mutual aid groups coming from our membership. And that is a transformative power that's needed for us to model what a regenerative economy looks like, the part of sacredness and community aspect and cooperation. So I think about all of our community as like a testing ground and practicing ground and workout space for us to really transform this world by being and being different. Because we could have chose to stay in our silos, put our heads down, and continue being exploited in the extractive economy. But we are pushing against that and deciding to be like, let's resist that and create anew and be different together. And that is is the essence and the lifeblood of our community. And that is what is ultimately going to the vehicle for us to build power, because we need a taste of what the new world could be like. A lot of times we are impatient, but we get little tastes that it's possible here together. We can go that journey. And here's the quote. It's my favorite. So don't forget this, because history is really important, because I think history is so key to all of our heritage and our individual lives, no matter what culture that we come from or heritage we come from, because it's part of our wholeness. Like even though we might have histories that we're not very proud of, it's still part of our being. And I encourage everyone to check out the Domestic Workers Her Stories website, and also start digging into your histories, and even like checking with your families, especially having the old tradition of talking to family members who hold history. And use that as your way to build your work and your everyday purpose. So we have about 15-ish minutes. I would love to have some Q&A and talk a bit, because I know the chat was really, really active, and I was like having serious FOMO in there. And I think Claudia was doing some stacking, so if she can help me surface some questions, that'd be so helpful. And I think I'll turn off the stop share. Yeah.
Thank you, Monique. That was wonderful. Great information. I think it's such an important work that you're all doing at Matahari. So there's a question from the last question I saw, that Yardena, she wants to know if your organization came up with the definition for transformative power.
Oh, no. So, so the National Domestic Workers Alliance is, I think they also adapted that themselves. So the National Domestic Workers Alliance, we drew from that power model and that definition. Oh, and I can share as part of the paper, what's it called? The part as like the materials that we share, the theory of change from National Domestic Workers Alliance, if that's helpful for folks. Yeah, because we're doing a lot of theory of change work right now, and even though that nonprofit kind of like thing usually is not my vibe, the process itself has been very helpful for people to move through our intention, our purpose, and alignment.
Great. Himas is asking, what does political home mean?
Mm-hmm. So political home to me and to Matahari is the place where you're rooted to do political work in this world. If you're involved, like some people think their political home is, or they align their political home with the Democratic Party or with the Republican Party or whatever working families party, those are political homes. But Matahari, we're trying to build a political home for ourselves, even though we're not a party or like a voting party. So it's just a place where you do political work and organizing. And we put the home aspect because we want to make sure that the element of home is named in there, because particularly for our community, we are a lot of us are immigrants, people of color that are always seeking home. And I feel like a lot of times all of us in an essence are searching for home, whether it be ourselves or with each other, but we put political home together just for us to have some alignment. It's like, what are we here? We're trying to create a political home for each other. That means that we care for each other, but we also do active political work that transforms our conditions. So it's like, we're hustling, but we're also caring for each other. So there's a balance.
I noticed there was a lot of talk about universities having mandated internships that have to be unpaid. A lot of students had to work jobs for that. What's your opinion on that, Monique?
Yeah, I think that labor should be should be paid for, because someone benefits from that, whether it be the professor, the institution, someone benefits from that free labor. So it should be fairly compensated. And there's actually a lot of movement happening, particularly around PhD or graduate students who do a lot of that unpaid labor. They are organizing unions in universities so that they can ensure that they have a contract and they get paid for that. And there's a lot more institutions that, or what's it called, fields that are being more competitive by really putting paid internships. And also I'm noticing there's less, even in the Matahari context, there's actually more students who apply for membership, apply for internships with Matahari with paid resources from the institution. So there's some progress with that, but definitely there's a lot of exploitation that happens in the student context. And that also creates a culture for them to be exploited when they get their first job too, because they're so used to being paid and undervalued. So when you take your first job, you kind of take it because your debt is so hard, your debt is so high, you just really want to put your foot in there. It's kind of like considered like necessary evil for you to move into that industry. And I don't believe in that. And I think there needs to be trickle down or have more corporations invest in internship programs and paid experiences for students.
Absolutely. And there's also a question. It's regarding Camille Frank is a mental health counselor at a rape crisis center. And she's asking for an example of transformative power action, specifically in
Mm,
treatment of sexual violence.
mm. I think when I think about treatment of sexual violence, a lot of like after you're done with the immediate crisis mode and healing, there's a time whenever folks may be ready for community. And I think the power of having, because a lot of times whenever sexual violence is so deeply it's just so deeply like disorienting because it just like separates your spirit, your mind, and your body from everything. And people just want to disassociate, disorient, and there's a lot of shame with that. So the counter to that would be creating community spaces of survivors for them to heal together and also name this collective experience. It kind of it's not your fault because it's part of the systemic system that aims to devalue you enough that people think that they can take that from you. You know, um, your essence and your bodily autonomy. So I think the transformative power action is like modeling that survivors don't have to be alone, that they are powerful actors in narratives. And there's actually sexual assault survivors like Bill of Rights. Who knows that specific name? But there's like a national like Bill of Rights for that, and there's a lot of movement now around survivors leading campaigns to establish protections for sexual assault survivors in different states. Yeah, so that's an example, I think. So you just have to counter that. So whatever folks are feeling, what folks are experiencing now and what they're noticing, try to imagine and help them self-direct what would be the opposite of that and help them create that, and I think that's really important. Oh yeah, Anita, actually I had to look up my Instagram if I know that Bill. But I'm like having like so much I'll put that in there as part of the resource too, because it's a great movement because it's very millennial, zennial, Generation X. So it's really like accessible for people. It's a large community of survivors just being very like, okay, we're gonna get our revenge by passing laws. And I'm like, oh, that's totally my jam. So it's like it's become a powerful vehicle for sexual assault survivors to build their power and their narrative and coming out with their stories. Because a lot of times that silence and that shame it eats you up. It eats you up in all contexts of violence. So any opportunities for folks to be able to do the opposite and come out and be supported in community is a key way to intervene and part of that healing.
Abigail has a question. As an advocate at nonprofits, what approach can she take in exercising political power?
Mm. Is it with the organization or like moving with your organization to do more political work? Can you like specify a little bit? Or like doing or let me see. Okay. Yeah. I think it's if hopefully your supervisors and your institutions are maybe doing some reflection and reflecting about the strategic approach to your work in the field and naming the possibility of being more political to attack at the root causes. I think a lot of the tension in service providers and organizers is that there isn't a lot of bridging between the two because they're symbiotic and support one another. Like service providers, they do the critical work of addressing the immediate violence, and then and the organizing folks are trying to attack the root causes, but they support each other, but there needs to be more integration. Because so that could be a possibility. How about like even like linking up with the organization that is like doing more organizing with survivors and direct root cause work, and maybe doing partnerships or sending survivors over there, and even volunteering as staff as part of the other organization. That could be a key opportunity too. That's like a low lift, because that would be cool to even have organizers and service providers working so closely together, because you align more about your narrative and how to become more stronger, like being able to relate and work together as you support survivors who are experiencing the direct harm of every day, but also folks who are doing the stewardship work of intervening and also of attacking at the root causes.
Sophia has an interesting comment. She said that when people are not paid for their internships, it deepens the class divide of who is move into that field.
Totally. It also breaks down into also like racial, right? A lot of folks who are folks of color can't afford to do that. So it definitely does add to the economic like suppression of folks for sure. Yes, a fun fact is that, I mean, maybe this is like a good outcome, but I was actually an undergrad. I studied nutrition, and as part of becoming a dietitian, you actually had to take on an internship that you actually had to pay for. I'm like, I just paid for undergrad. I hustled 3 jobs just to pay for undergrad, and you were telling me that I had to apply. I had to apply to become a dietitian, but I had to go through an internship and take a test. And I might even make the same amount of money I would as an undergrad doing another field. So I was like, forget that. I can't afford another couple of years of not working and also paying for internship and just to make the same. So here I am in Matahari because of that outcome. But yeah, even in the dietitian field, nutrition field, you can see the class and the race breakdown of who can actually do that work, who becomes a dietitian because of that internship program itself. Those are types of ways that institutions are able to make sure that folks are not able to come up in other cultures and races and classes. Oh, I see Phoebe's a dietitian. Yeah. That's a good comment. I wonder why. Yeah, because it's so true, because like, we need to have people in the dietitian field to be reflective of the community and stuff, and this is really not effective. Yeah, because it's like culturally specific, especially in all of our work, right? Like survivors and people who are in the community, they're just so diverse. So we need even all industries need to be more diverse, and then like these industries become less relevant because they're not effective, and yeah, it's a lot. We could go all day, Phoebe. I have a lot of feelings.
It seems like we ran out of questions. Anyone else? Thank you so much, Monique. This was wonderful. I think we all really enjoyed this this conversation. This presentation had a lot of important information that it's a movement that it's very important to us to bring up and talk about it in our community.
Yeah, thank you so much for everyone. I'm really resonating with all the folks who are struggling with even school. Like, you might even notice that all of the work that we want to do is gendered, right? So like we're questioning like the actual like industries are gendered and there's wage suppression of that, but then the barriers to even getting there is just like a big scam for all of us. Since we have 5 minutes, I noticed that people really resonating with the somatics practice earlier. Do folks want to do that again as a closing?
Sure, Monique, there's just one question. Sarah wants to know if there's a template to the domestic workers law you mentioned.
Oh yeah, I can share the domestic workers law too. Yeah, definitely. And her story site for sure. Okay, definitely. They're gonna be posted on the website, right, Claudia? like
Yes.
materials and
Yes,
stuff?
we
Okay.
will have everything on the website.
Yes. So Phoebe, no, her stories, yes. So Phoebe's saying on her stories website, yes. As part of the her stories, we're also creating videos multilingually. So the intention of this project is to have the workers in the movement, leaders, to actually become facilitators themselves, so that you can amplify and accelerate the movement. So all these materials are helpful for them to become organizers for themselves. So like definitely videos and little snippets of um, of the histories and also curriculum around different forms of power and political education is forthcoming. Great. So I'm gonna try to download the chat too. I noticed some folks who are trying to reach out to me, but yeah, so folks are welcome to stay and do the closing breathing exercise with me, or if you need a bio break and you know recollect yourself before the next session, whatever moves you. So again, we are moving into grounded somatics practice for us to be in alignment with ourselves. Take a moment to root yourself again with your feet shoulder width apart and feet planted in the ground, because this is where your tree trunk rooted to the earth. And you are rooted to this earth to do great things and to grow as an individual and care for all the things and provide shade and power and air for the people around you and yourself. Keep breathing in and out. In and out. Breathe into your width from shoulder to shoulder. And this is your expansion in the world and your reach. Breathe into that. And breathe into your length and your dignity. That is your rootedness in this world, and also your head connected to your future and the manifestations that you want for the world and for the people that you care for and yourself. So breathe into your length, and you're taller and stretching and reaching for the earth. And also feel free to, you know, move your shoulders, releasing some tension, even raising your arms as you breathe up and down, width to width, shoulder to shoulder. Let's just take some time to breathe for yourself and be mindful of your width and your length in this world. Keep breathing. And you are put in this world to do amazing things, and you do it every day. And even though the world might not visibilize it or recognize it, you are worth it and you are enough. And you will continue to steward that for yourself and other people. Breathing and be really proud of yourself because you have survived and you're here today, and everything that you're holding. And my hope and blessing to all of you that you leave this space a little bit more connected to each other, a little bit more informed, and ready to take action in whether it be even taking action to rest more, even taking action to connect more with other organizations or becoming more political. Any action you take from this, even for you to take a rest or even take some breath for yourself, is key. So I'm gonna count down from 3, 2, 1, and return back. Thank you everyone for your time, and I'm really happy to connect with everyone.